But I didn't listen closely because what I'm about to say may shift how you see yourself forever. If someone pulls away from you, avoids you, hesitates with you, or suddenly becomes distant, it's easy to assume you were too much, too intense, too deep. But what if the truth is this? You weren't too much, you were simply too real. What if the discomfort they feel isn't because of your flaws, but because your presence mirrors something powerful they haven't yet become? Stay with me because this message is not about rejection, it's about revelation. Here is what the avoidant truly sees when they look at you. They see royalty, even if you don't always recognize it yourself. Not royalty in ego, but royalty in essence. You carry a quiet authority, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Your energy says, I know who I am, and for someone who is emotionally fragmented, that is terrifying. They see value not surface value, but intrinsic worth. You don't chase approval. You don't beg for connection. Even when you love deeply, there is dignity in you. And dignity is threatening to those who survive through emotional distance. You see, avoidance is not confidence. It is self-protection wrap, fed in fear. And when someone who avoids connection encounters someone who embodies wholeness, purpose, and emotional clarity, their nervous system panics. Not because you are dangerous, but because you are revealing. Your consistency unsettles them. You show up as the same person, grounded, intentional, sincere. That consistency exposes the chaos within them. You become a mirror, and many people would rather run than face their own reflection. Your boundaries speak louder than words. You don't over-explain. You don't abandon yourself to be chosen. You understand, perhaps intuitively, that love without respect is not love at all. And for someone who equates closeness with loss of control, your boundaries feel like rejection even though they are simply self-honor. They sense your emotional depth. You are not afraid of truth. You can sit with discomfort. You can have conversations that require honesty, accountability, and presence. That level of emotional maturity feels unsafe to someone who learned to survive by shutting down. And here is the sacred truth many don't tell you. Your growth reminds them of the life they are avoiding. You are walking forward, healing, expanding, becoming more aligned with purpose. And your very existence whispers to them, you could live deeper, love fuller, heal more. But growth requires responsibility, and avoidance resists responsibility at all costs. This is why they hesitate. This is why they disappear. This is why they keep you at arm's length. Not because you lack value, but because you carry it. So don't shrink. Don't dull your light. Don't question your worth because someone else could not meet you at your level of consciousness. You were not sent to convince. You were not created to chase. You were not designed to beg for connection. You are here to embody truth, to walk in self-respect, and to align with relationships that recognize your worth without fear. Let them misunderstand you. Let them retreat. Let them choose comfort over growth. You continue becoming. Because royalty does not pursue validation, it stands in value. Avoidant behavior is often triggered by strength, not weakness, and this truth alone can liberate you from years of self-doubt. When someone withdraws, hesitates, or emotionally disappears in your presence, the instinct is to internalize it as a flaw. But avoidance is rarely a response. Fitted an E to inadequacy. It is a reaction to intensity of presence, clarity of self, and inner authority. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly, firmly, unapologetically. And that kind of strength destabilizes people who survive by staying emotionally small. An avoidant is not afraid of love in theory, they are afraid of what love requires. Love requires exposure. Love requires accountability. Love requires emotional availability. When you carry strength, you naturally invite depth. Your energy says, come closer, but come honestly. And for someone whose nervous system equates closeness with danger, that invitation feels like a threat. Not because you are demanding, but because you are grounded. Your strength shows in the way you don't chase. You don't collapse when attention shifts. You don't bargain for consistency. You may feel deeply, but you do not abandon yourself to be chosen. That self-possession unsettles those who learned early that survival meant emotional detachment. They interpret your stability as pressure, your clarity as expectation, your presence as exposure. You are not asking them to be more, you are simply being more, and that contrast is loud. Avoidant also carries discernment. You notice patterns. You ask meaningful questions. You sense when something is misaligned. Avoidant individuals often rely on ambiguity to stay comfortable. They prefer undefined connections, emotional loopholes, and unspoken rules. Your strength naturally brings definition, and definition removes hiding places. When there is nowhere left to hide, withdrawal feels safer than truth. There is also a spiritual dimension to this. Strength recognizes worth without needing permission. It moves with quiet certainty. When you know who you are, you don't contort yourself to fit someone else's fear. You don't dilute your needs to maintain proximity. This self-recognition acts like a mirror, and mirrors are confronting. They reflect not only what is present but what is missing. Avoidant behavior is often misinterpreted as confidence or independence, but beneath it is a fragile internal structure. When someone with strength enters their world, it exposes the cracks they have been avoiding. Your emotional availability highlights their emotional absence. Your consistency reveals their inconsistency. Your courage to feel reveals their fear of feeling. None of this is your doing it is simply the contrast created by authenticity. This is why strength triggers retreat. It asks without speaking. It challenges without accusing. It invites growth without forcing it. And those who are not ready to grow often mistake the invitation as danger. So they distance, they rationalize, they disappear, not because you overwhelm them, but because you awaken something they were not prepared to face. Your strength is not aggressive. It is not demanding. It is not too much. It is anchored. And anchored people naturally disrupt unanchored systems. If someone avoids you, it is not proof that you are unlovable. It is evidence that your presence carries weight. And weight reveals what is weak, unresolved, or unfinished in others. Your self-worth challenges their emotional limitations in ways that go far beyond surface interaction. When you carry a rooted sense of value, you move through relationships differently. You do not enter asking to be chosen, you enter already chosen by yourself. That inner posture is deeply confronting to someone whose emotional world is built on scarcity, self-doubt, or conditional worth. They may not consciously recognize it, but your self-respect disrupts the internal narratives they use to feel safe. An avoidant structure often relies on control, not dominance, but emotional regulation through distance. They manage anxiety by limiting attachment, minimizing needs, and staying just detached enough to avoid vulnerability. Your self-worth makes that strategy ineffective. You are not easily manipulated by inconsistency. You do not overfunction to keep someone engaged. You notice when effort is imbalanced, when presence fades, when words and actions no longer align. That awareness alone feels threatening to someone who depends on emotional loopholes. When you know your worth, you don't tolerate ambiguity for long. You may be patient, but you are not confused. You ask for clarity, not out of insecurity, but out of alignment. And clarity is uncomfortable for someone whose emotional capacity has never expanded beyond avoidance. They feel exposed not because you are interrogating them, but because your standards silently ask, "Can you meet me here?" That question requires honesty, and honesty demands emotional bandwidth they may not possess. Your self-worth also removes the illusion of superiority avoida can create. Emotional distance often gives people a false sense of power. It allows them to feel in control, unneeded, unaffected. But when they encounter someone who does not chase, does not beg, and does not collapse in response to withdrawal, that illusion breaks. Your calm communicates, "I will not abandon myself to keep you." And for someone who expects others to overinvest, this feels like rejection even though it is simply self-respect. There is another layer many overlook. Your self-worth activates their unhealed shame. Not because you shame them, but because your self-acceptance highlights what they have not yet resolved within themselves. You are comfortable with your emotions. You acknowledge your needs without apology. You can hold intimacy without losing yourself. This contrast awakens an internal tension, a silent awareness of emotional underdevelopment. Rather than grow into that awareness, many retreat from it. Your presence communicates equality. You don't pedestal. You don't perform. You don't seek validation through sacrifice. You meet people eye to eye, and that level ground removes the dynamics avoidant individuals unconsciously rely on: distance, mist, power imbalance. Without those buffers, connection feels too real, too accountable, too close to truth. This is why your self-worth doesn't inspire comfort in someone who avoids depth, it inspires confrontation. Not outward confrontation, but inward reckoning. They feel seen without being studied, measured without being judged. And when someone is not yet equipped to expand emotionally, they interpret that internal pressure as incompatibility rather than invitation. So when they pull away, it is not because you asked for too much. It is because your self-worth made it impossible for them to remain emotionally small without noticing it. Your consistency exposes their fear of intimacy in ways that words never could. Consistency is not loud. It doesn't demand attention or make promises it cannot keep. It simply is. And that steady presence becomes deeply unsettling to someone whose emotional survival depends on unpredictability and distance. When you show up as the same grounded, intentional person over time, you remove the emotional escape routes they rely on. Avoidant individuals often equate intimacy with loss of autonomy, loss of control, loss of emotional safety. To manage this fear, they unconsciously create inconsistency. They engage, then withdraw. They offer warmth, then distance. This fluctuation allows them to experience connection without surrendering to it. Your consistency disrupts this pattern. You don't mirror their push-pull. You don't become erratic to maintain access. You remain steady, and that steadiness becomes a mirror they cannot ignore. Consistency communicates reliability. It says, "You can count on me." But to someone who learned that closeness leads to pain, reliability does not feel safe, it feels binding. Your emotional presence invites them to relax into connection, yet relaxation is exactly what their nervous system resists. Intimacy requires settling, and settling requires trust. For someone wired for self-protection, trust feels like exposure. Your consistency also reveals truth over time. Inconsistent people rely on short bursts of intensity to substitute for depth. They create connection through novelty, mystery, or emotional spikes. But consistency dissolves illusion. Over time, patterns become visible. Needs become clearer. Expectations quietly form. And with expectations comes accountability, not imposed, be implied. That implication alone can trigger retreat. When you remain consistent, you communicate emotional maturity. You do not punish with silence. You do not disappear to regain power. You do not create confusion to feel desired. You stay present, responsive, and clear. For someone whose fear of intimacy is rooted in emotional underdevelopment, this level of presence feels overwhelming. They may describe it as pressure, boredom, or loss of spark, but beneath those words is fear of being fully known. Consistency invites depth without force. It allows space for vulnerability to emerge naturally. And vulnerability is where avoidant defenses weaken. To stay emotionally distant, they must keep parts of themselves hidden. Your consistency gently illuminates those hidden places. Not by interrogation, but by proximity. Over time, your steady presence asks an unspoken question. Will you let yourself be seen? For someone not ready to answer, withdrawal feels safer than honesty. There is also a power in your consistency that cannot be controlled. You are not reactive. You don't chase emotional highs or crash with emotional lows. This emotional regulation destabilizes someone who relies. They didn't on chaos to feel in control. They cannot predict you by manipulating distance. They cannot reset the dynamic by disappearing. And when their usual strategies fail, they confront the truth. Intimacy requires courage, not control. So they may step back, not because consistency is boring, but because it is revealing. It removes fantasy and replaces it with reality. It asks them to meet you in presence, not performance. And for someone whose fear of intimacy has never been healed, that invitation feels like standing at the edge of something vast, beautiful, but terrifying. Your consistency does not chase intimacy. It simply makes fear visible. Your standards confront their unhealed wounds in ways that feel deeply personal, even when you have said nothing at all. Standards are not ultimatums. They are not demands. They are simply the natural expression of what you value, what you allow, and what you no longer tolerate. When you carry healthy standards, you move through relationships with clarity and self-respect. And for someone whose emotional foundation is built on avoidance, those standards feel like exposure. Avoidant individuals often survive by lowering expectations both of they and of themselves. They tell themselves that needing less is strength, that detachment is independence, that emotional minimalism is maturity. Your standards quietly dismantle those narratives. You expect consistency. You value communication. You honor emotional presence. Not because you are rigid, but because you are aligned. And alignment confronts avoidance at its core. Your standards activate their unhealed wounds because they highlight what was never modeled, never nurtured, or never healed. When you require honesty, it touches the places where they learned to hide. When you value emotional availability, it presses against the parts of them that learned to shut down. When you choose respect over chemistry, it exposes the ways they confuse intensity with connection. None of this is an attack, but the nervous system does not always distinguish between invitation and threat. Standards also eliminate ambiguity. Avoidant dynamics thrive in gray areas, undefined relationships, unclear expectations, emotional loopholes. Your standards bring quiet definition. You may not issue ultimatums, but your behavior speaks. You don't overextend to compensate for lack of effort. You don't normalize inconsistency. You don't stay silent when something feels misaligned. This clarity forces them to confront themselves. And confrontation with self is what unhealed wounds resist most. There is also a deep shame response triggered by standards. When someone knows on some level that they cannot meet what is being modeled, they may interpret standards as judgment. Your self-respect becomes a reminder of their emotional limitations. Instead of rising to meet the standard, many retreat to avoid feeling inadequate. Avoidance becomes a defense against the pain of self-awareness. Your standards communicate self-trust. You trust your discernment. You trust your needs. You trust that you are worthy of reciprocity. This self-trust destabilizes people who learn to abandon themselves to maintain connection. They may feel subconsciously challenged by your refusal to self-betray. Your no carries weight because it is rooted in truth, not punishment. And here's the part that often goes unspoken. Your standards represent growth. They signal that you have done inner work, that you have learned from pain rather than numbing it. For someone who has postponed healing, your growth fee, pressure. Not because you demand change, but because your presence asks, are you willing to evolve? That question awakens old wounds tied to inadequacy, fear, and emotional neglect. So when they distance themselves, it is not because your standards are too high. It is because your standards illuminated wounds they were not ready to heal. And rather than confront those wounds, they choose the familiarity of emotional distance over the courage of transformation. Your presence reflects value they don't believe they deserve. And that reflection can be deeply unsettling to someone shaped by emotional avoidance. When you walk into a connection carrying self-respect, emotional awareness, and a grounded sense of worth, you don't just offer companionship, you embody possibility. And possibility is confronting to those who have internalized unworthiness. Avoidant individuals often carry a quiet belief that deep, consistent love is either unsafe or unattainable. This belief is rarely conscious. It forms early through experiences where emotional needs were minimized, dismissed, or met with inconsistency. Over time, they adapt by lowering expectations and convincing themselves that is strength. When they encounter someone whose presence communicates value without performance, that internal belief system begins to crack. Your presence says, without words, connection can be healthy. Love can be steady. Intimacy does not have to cost you yourself. For someone who has never truly believed that, your energy feels unfamiliar. Instead of inspiring hope, it awakens discomfort. Because to accept what you represent, they would have to confront the painful possibility that they have been settling not by choice, but by fear. There is also a worthiness wound activated by your presence. You offer respect naturally. You communicate thoughtfully. You hold space without overfunctioning. This level of relational integrity feels undeserved to someone who has learned to associate closeness with shame or emotional debt. They may enjoy your presence, but simultaneously feel unqualified to receive it. Rather than rise into worthiness, they withdraw to avoid the vulnerability of being seen as valuable. Your presence highlights contrast. You are emotionally available without being needy. You are confident without being closed. You care without losing yourself. That exposes the internal imbalance they have normalized. It gently asks, why do you run from what you say you want? And that question is painful for someone whose identity has been shaped around emotional self-protection. When someone does not believe they deserve something good, they often sabotage it, not consciously, but instinctively. Distance becomes safer than intimacy. Withdrawal feels more familiar than receiving. Your presence offers something their nervous system does not yet know how to hold. So instead of leaning in, they create space not because you lack value, but because you carry more than they believe you are worthy of. There is also fear of loss beneath this dynamic. If they allow themselves to fully receive your presence, they risk caring deeply. And caring deeply means risking pain. For someone who has learned that pain follows attachment, avoiding attachment feels like wisdom. Your grounded presence invites them into a different experience, one that requires courage rather than control. Your value is not loud. It does not seek validation. It does not demand recognition. And that quiet confidence is what makes it so powerful. It reflects back to them a version of themselves they have not yet accepted, someone worthy of depth, consistency, and love. Rather than face that reflection, they may turn away from it. So when they step back, understand this. Your presence did not overwhelm them. It revealed something they were not ready to believe about themselves. Your emotional depth feels overwhelming to those who avoid vulnerability, not because depth is dangerous, but because it dissolves the walls they depend on for emotional safety. Emotional depth is the ability to feel fully, to sit with complexity, to acknowledge truth without escaping it. When you carry this depth, you don't skim the surface of connection, you naturally invite authenticity. And for someone whose survival strategy has been emotional avoidance, authenticity feels like exposure. Avoidant individuals often learned early that emotions were inconvenient, unsafe, or unwelcome. They adapted by minimizing feelings, intellectualizing experiences, or staying distracted. Vulnerability became associated with loss of control or emotional pain. When they encounter someone who is comfortable with emotional nuance, it unsettles them. You speak the language they have spent you, avoiding, not aggressively, not forcefully, simply fluently. Your emotional depth shows in your capacity to name feelings, to ask meaningful questions, and to remain present during discomfort. You don't rush past tension. You don't numb yourself to maintain peace. You are willing to explore what is real. For someone who has learned to regulate their nervous system through distance, this level of presence feels overwhelming. They may describe it as intensity, heaviness, or too much, but beneath those labels is fear of being emotionally seen. Depth removes the option to stay shallow. It invites connection beyond roles, beyond surface compatibility, beyond performance. When you bring emotional depth into a dynamic, you signal that connection matters, that it deserves attention, care, and honesty. And that signal triggers internal alarms in someone who associates closeness with vulnerability they do not know how to manage. There is also a sense of inadequacy that emotional depth can awaken. When you are emotionally literate, you can articulate experiences others can barely sense. You can hold space for complexity without shutting down. This highlights the emotional limitations of someone who has not developed those skills. Rather than leaning in to learn, many retreat to protect their sense of competence. Your depth also slows things down. It requires reflection. It asks for integration. Avoidant patterns thrive on movement, staying busy, staying distracted, staying just out of reach. Emotional depth invites stillness, and stillness is where unprocessed feelings surface. For someone who has spent years avoiding their inner world, that stillness feels threatening. There is a quiet courage in emotional depth. It says, I am not afraid of truth. That courage exposes fear in others. You don't force them to feel, but your presence makes avoidance more visible. They feel the gap between what they express and what they suppress. That gap becomes uncomfortable. And rather than bridge it, they may step away from the one who revealed it. Your emotional depth does not demand vulnerability, it models it. And modeling is powerful. It creates a standard without imposing one. For someone not ready to meet that standard, distance becomes a form of self-protection. They may convince themselves that they prefer lightness, independence, or emotional simplicity. But often, what they are really avoiding is the depth within themselves. So when someone pulls away from you, understand this. Your emotional depth did not push them away. It simply reached further than their capacity to follow. Your boundaries highlight their lack of inner structure, and that exposure can feel deeply destabilizing to someone who relies on avoidance to regulate themselves. Boundaries are not walls. They are internal framework signals of self-awareness, self-respect, and emotional responsibility. When you have clear boundaries, you move through relationships with intention rather than impulse. And that internal structure stands in stark contrast to someone whose emotional world is governed by fear and reactivity. Avoidant individuals often appear independent, but beneath that surface is often a lack of internal containment. Their sense of safety comes from external control, controlling closeness, timing, and emotional exposure. Boundaries, however, reflect internal regulation. You do not need to control others to feel safe, you manage yourself. That difference is confronting. You're calm, no. Your steady pace, your refusal to overextend all reveal an emotional maturity may not yet possess. Your boundaries remove confusion. You don't send mixed signals. You don't stay silent to keep peace. You communicate limits with clarity, not hostility. This clarity feels restrictive to someone who relies on ambiguity to stay comfortable. Ambiguity allows them to drift in and out without accountability. Your boundaries quietly say, "This is where I stand." And that statement forces them to either rise into integrity or retreat into distance. There is also a mirror effect at play. Your boundaries reflect where they lack their own. Someone without inner structure often struggles to identify their needs, regulate emotions, or remain consistent. They may oscillate between closeness and withdrawal because they don't know how to hold both autonomy and intimacy at once. Your grounded boundaries expose this imbalance, not by comparison, but by contrast. Boundaries also trigger a loss of control for avoidant individuals. When you do not bend yourself to accommodate inconsistency, their usual strategies lose power. They cannot pull you closer by disappearing. They cannot test your worth by withholding. You remain anchored, and anchoring is uncomfortable for someone. Emotional safety depends on movement and distance. Your boundaries communicate self-trust. You trust your instincts. You honor your limits without guilt. You do not negotiate your well-being to preserve connection. This self-trust is threatening to someone who learned to abandon themselves to maintain relationships. Your ability to choose yourself without drama highlights their inability to do the same. There is often resentment beneath avoidance, not toward you, but toward themselves. When they encounter someone who has done the work of building inner structure, it awakens awareness of what they lack. That awareness can feel shameful. Rather than face that shame, they project discomfort outward, labeling you as rigid, demanding, or distant, when in truth, you are simply self-led. Your boundaries do not punish. They protect. They create safety through clarity. And clarity requires responsibility. For someone who has avoided responsibility for their emotional life, your boundaries feel like pressure. Not because you impose them, but because they remove the option to remain undefined. So if someone steps back when you hold your boundaries, understand this. Your limits did not push them away. They revealed the absence of limits within them, and that realization requires growth they may not yet be ready to embrace. Your growth reminds them of the work they've been postponing, and that reminder can feel heavier than rejection itself. Growth is not just change, it is conscious evolution. It is the willingness to look inward, take responsibility, and choose healing over hiding. When you are growing, it shows in your language, your choices, your boundaries, and the way you relate to others. And for someone who has survived by delaying inner work, your growth becomes an uncomfortable mirror. Avoidant individuals often intellectualize self-awareness. They may understand concepts of healing, attachment, or emotional intelligence on a surface level, but understanding is not transformation. Growth requires embodiment. It requires feeling what was once avoided. When they encounter someone who has actually done the work, who regulates emotions, communicates clearly, and chooses alignment over chaos, it exposes the gap between knowing and becoming. Your growth carries momentum. You are moving forward, integrating lessons, and releasing patterns that once kept. That movement highlights their stagnation, not because you judge them, but because growth has a frequency. It changes how you respond to inconsistency. It shifts what you tolerate. It clarifies what no longer fits. This energetic shift makes it difficult for someone who is standing still to remain comfortable in your presence. There is also grief beneath avoidance. Growth requires mourning old versions of self, the survival strategies that once protected but now limit. For someone who has not yet faced that grief, your growth feels like loss. It reminds them of the safety they find in old patterns, even if those patterns are painful. Rather than release what no longer serves them, they cling to familiarity. And your growth challenges that attachment. Your evolution also introduces accountability. You no longer engage in cycles that drain you. You don't revisit lessons you've already integrated. This quiet refusal to regress feels like abandonment to someone who is still living in the past. They may interpret your forward movement as emotional distance, when in truth, it is self-respect. Growth also alters your expectations not into demands, but into discernment. You recognize effort. You notice the presence. You value emotional reciprocity. These shifts are subtle but powerful. They ask the people around you to either grow with you or fall out of alignment. For someone who has postponed healing, this choice feels overwhelming. Choosing growth means facing discomfort they have spent years avoiding. Your growth does not pressure, it simply progresses. And progression reveals who is ready to walk alongside you and who is not. For avoidant individuals, staying connected to someone who is evolving requires vulnerability, humility, and courage. Without those tools, retreat feels safer than transformation. So when they distance themselves, understand this. Your growth did not make you incompatible. It made visible the work they were not yet willing to begin. So if someone could not stay, could not meet you, or could not choose the depth you offered, let this be the truth you carry forward. You were never too much, never misaligned, never lacking. You were simply standing in your value, walking in your growth, and embodying a strength that requires courage to meet. Release the need to be understood by those who are still avoiding themselves and continue. They didn't honoring who you are becoming with grace, dignity, and self-trust. Thank you for allowing this message to meet you where you are, for listening with an open heart, and for choosing awareness over self-doubt. Until we meet again, walk gently, stay grounded, and goodbye.